Okay, welcome to our final session, week 13. We're going to be looking today at the topic of corporate social irresponsibility and corporate reputation. This topic gets into the dark side of corporate behavior. It seems to imply some kinds of ethical choices that people in corporations or that organizations make between doing good, being responsible, but also bad behavior, unethical behavior, which results in scandals and problems of legitimacy. So I'd like to look at this aspect of corporate social irresponsibility, look at what drives irresponsibility, and what role reputation plays, for example, the potential loss of reputation through scandals and so forth, could play in the governance of maintaining higher social standards. So we'll look at the relationship between irresponsibility and corporate reputation itself. So the first thing is we get into our basic definitions of the topic. Corporate social irresponsibility is a set of corporate actions that negatively affects an identifiable stakeholders' legitimate claims in the long run. What's legitimate? Legitimacy is a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within a socially constructed systems of norms, values, beliefs, or definitions. You may be familiar with the concept of legitimacy from institutional theory and the basic idea that corporations need a license to operate to be socially accepted in the society. What is legitimate would depend on history, politics, time and place, and social circumstances. So just like CSR, when we talked about good behavior, what constitutes irresponsible behavior is also a contested concept, which depends on, it's basically, there's claims for behavior to be responsible or irresponsibility or irresponsible, and there can be disagreement among different stakeholder groups about this. So just how unethical are corporations? Very interesting study from the early 2000s looked at the Fortune 100 companies and tried to count, within this 5-year span, how much unethical behavior they could observe. Turns out quite a lot. 20 of the Fortune 100 in the United States had engaged in accounting fraud. You might see in this list our special case of Enron, which we spent a lot of time on, but Enron was not an isolated case. Most major banks, investment firms, also productive firms like Boeing, oil companies, IBM, all had accounting issues. We see again securities fraud, many of the same companies, 13 cases out of 100. Consumer fraud, here we see Dow Chemical, Coca-Cola, Ford Motor, all had problems with consumer issues. Discrimination, slightly more rare, but Boeing, Coca-Cola, Ford, General Motors, IBM, Morgan Stanley, all had cases related to gender or racial discrimination, antitrust issues, issues around executive pay, patent infringement, or other kinds of illegal behavior. Taken together, 40% of the top 100 firms in this period engaged in very substantial misdeeds. How serious are they? Here again, there's some variation that we see between, in the same study, tried to classify most unacceptable, second most, and sort of the least unacceptable. So if we go from the bottom, you can see that here these are bad behaviors that led to the company being fines or settling lawsuits of less than 100 million. So for example, Walmart paid 11 million in a lawsuit for illegal workers, or we see that, for example, Lehman Brothers had to pay a fine of 62.7 million related to securities fraud. Then we see category 2, which the authors of the study describe as behavior that led to fines or settlements of less than 1 billion but more than 100 million, and which included more than one offense. So we see here, well, a long list of things. And then the most unacceptable are which led to fines or settlements of $1 billion or more. And here we see, for example, Philip Morris cigarettes, which promoted multiple deaths. Ford Motor also had health and safety issues. And the Enron case, which was, of course, the major fraud, but not far behind them, Citigroup, Bank of America, JP Morgan, and Chase. So long before the financial market problems of the late 2000s, like when Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, 2009, we see already that there's very substantially bad behavior going on in the financial sector. So there's obviously a big problem here of governance. And so when we think about irresponsible behavior, we probably also have in mind a kind of sister concept or related concept of corruption. So corruption is a bit more specific. It's a particular maybe kind of irresponsible behavior that refers to the misuse of an organizational position or authority for personal gain or organizational gain, where misuse refers to departures from accepted social norm. So corruption doesn't just mean illegal behavior, but it sort of implies misusing authority or position within the organization, right? So, for example, a government official takes bribes, or a manager misuses company expense accounts for personal gains, or to hire relatives, or some kind of doing favors for people, right? So, examples of corruption are quite diverse: private appropriation or fraudulent use of funds, misrepresenting the financial condition of the firm, receiving bribes, industrial espionage, price fixing, anti-competitive behavior, illegal environmental damage, poor working conditions, tax evasion, deceptive or false advertising. Now, interesting thing here is to say, well, what about a case where a company engages in a mass redundancy, they lay off their workers, but in the same time the CEO doing these actions received a huge bonus. So at least most people in the United States would not call that corruption. They would maybe call it rewarding a tough management decision. In Germany, or for example in Japan, I think these kinds of norms are less socially acceptable, and one might at least anecdotally or informally say, well, the managers are rather kind of corrupted, or at least something's not quite right. So again, what constitutes corruption, just like any kind of irresponsible behavior, maybe depend on the kind of social context and the social norms. So when we get into irresponsible behavior, we're getting a bit on the terrain of ethics and the idea of two different kind of views about the nature of the firm and ethical aspects of government. And one is that simply that profit-making activity is a fundamentally ethical activity. Companies competing, making profits is basically good, and that breaking rules, corrupt behavior, irresponsible behavior are kind of aberrations. They're kind of exceptions that happen once in a while. Why is that? It's because, like the old business saying goes, honesty is the best policy, and that there's really no reason or no gain to be had by trying to cheat people, engage in corrupt or irresponsible behavior. So that basically we view that the main kind of system of the corporation is one that's basically ethical, and irresponsible behavior is a kind of deviance or deviant behavior. Now, from another, kind of more fundamental critique of capitalism or of the corporation, say that irresponsibility in some ways expresses a deep and inherent underlying rationale of the profit-making company activity. So firms always attempt to make more and more profits, and honesty is the best policy implies that, well, a company may choose to be not honest if conditions favor that, for example, hiding information is better for profit making. So here it's kind of implying that the kind of drive for more profits, the drive to follow incentive structures, is sort of inherently corrupting or inherently brings corporations to a kind of gray area of ethical activity, because always there's a kind of incentive or ability for individuals or whole organizations to a little bit more to try to increase profits. So when we discuss irresponsible behavior, again, one view is the sort of like that it's quite rare, it's a kind of deviance. Another view is that it's quite rampant and pervasive, that it's really that the kind of system of corporations, corporate governance, and corporate responsibility have a kind of inherent tension built in about it. So let's look now at the drivers of irresponsible behavior and what causes corporations, and so many corporations, to behave in these ways. So a simple way of thinking about what drives irresponsible behavior relates to profit seeking. The simple table imagines 4 different kinds of business activities. We have activities that are profitable for business or not profitable for business, and we have activities that are socially beneficial or socially harmful. Quadrant 1 is a kind of obvious case, the case that we hope for with CSR and business performance, where you have an activity that's profitable but also socially beneficial. Another clear case is a case which is not profitable but socially harmful. For example, a bad product, overinvestment, or underinvestment. These cases are both pretty clear, that we want to be in quadrant 1, we want to avoid the quadrant 3, even though this sometimes happens. There's some kind of gray areas, though, in terms of business ethics, things that are socially beneficial but not very profitable. For example, raising environmental standards, transferring technologies to developing countries, and so forth. They'd be good to have, they would help society as a whole, but they're not really going to help individual businesses to become more profitable. We also have another big area of activities which are profitable, good for business, but socially harmful. For example, pollution, consumer fraud, like in the case of Enron, financial misrepresentation, bribery, and so forth. So we have some clear cases, but also some gray areas of activity, and in some sense what we're aiming at is to try and figure out how we can basically increase the profitability of socially beneficial activities, so to shift some things from the quadrant 2 to quadrant 1, or we want to create less incentives for quadrant 4 activity, so to kind of punish more strongly socially harmful activities and shift them into areas of quadrant 3 so that there won't be a kind of drive for business to be doing these more and more. So we can think about each of these things, CSR and CSIR, again, as each having an upside and a downside. So being socially responsible can be good for business, creating relational assets, but may also have a high cost of investments or raising standards. So again, we want to capture more of this positive element and decrease the costs. Similarly, engaging in irresponsible activities, CSIR, is going to deplete relational assets, by which I mean customers won't want to buy your product again, or employees may become less motivated. So there'll be some kind of loss of relationships to stakeholders, but there's maybe a temptation to do so in this quadrant 3 area, because in the short term there's lower costs, like you won't be spending money on these CSR activities, or you'll be able to simply externalize costs such as pollution. So it turns out there's a lot of research that good firms actually do bad things, and that high performance, good business performance, is actually an important driver of irresponsible behavior. We saw this a bit in the case of Enron, that you're performing well now, and the fear or threat of worse future performance creates a lot of high pressure for companies to maintain a kind of endless growth, endless high profits, and that this kind of high pressure to meet expectations is actually a big driver, for example, of illegal behavior. Companies don't want to lose money, also like relative to past performance. So decisions, we know, are often gained on perceived gain or loss and depend on the reference point. So if you have a very high standard as your reference point, this can create a very big pressure. There's also other things in psychology, like the house money effect. Prior gains or losses influence risk-taking behavior. And we saw in the case of Enron that making the big money in a certain period of time make them very confident or overconfident to take even more risks in the future. And then we have the dynamic of hubris, that these high prior gains make managers think they're invincible, which again leads to more and more risk-taking. So we see that there's actually a relationship that the higher performances, stock market or operative performance, is relative to their a kind of baseline expectation, the likelihood of illegal corporate behavior increases quite dramatically. Okay? So there does seem to be something inherently kind of intrinsic to corporate activity, to the drive for profit making, that is related to irresponsible actions. So remember what Kenneth Lay said, I don't want us to ever be satisfied with the stock price, it should always be higher. So a fairly straightforward way in which performance and irresponsible behavior are linked relate to tax avoidance. And there was a very interesting study by the Guardian newspaper going back in 2012, looking at the largest UK companies, saying that their effective tax rate was just around 4 or 5%. They singled out some very big companies that were surprising. So you see here in McDonald's, the green bubble is the about £1.2 billion total revenue of McDonald's. You see the blue bubble is then the profits of McDonald's, 176 million. And then they paid 42 million in tax, which is about 3.4%. Okay. So, but let's draw your attention to example to Apple. We see again also on the right the turnover, profits before tax, tax paid, about 7%. So not terribly high, considering the rate of corporate taxation should be much higher. But particularly a few of these other cases got the public attention. For example, Amazon, probably this figure is much higher now, but the revenue was 207 million, but they declared very tiny profits, okay? Just around 3 million in profits and paid less than 2 million in taxes. So the effective tax rate of sort of less than 1%. So if we look a little bit into why that's the case, it turns out that all transactions that originate and complete in the UK, so if you order something, basically the order goes through a subsidiary in Luxembourg, right? And so many of the profits that Amazon is realizing basically only in the Luxembourg subsidiary and paying the much lower tax rate in Luxembourg. So if you look on, I don't have one handy, but one of your Amazon packages, for example, even now in Berlin, you may see that there's a stamp on something that looks French, and that it actually has been booked through the Luxembourg subsidiary. Okay. Kind of similar case in, so this is not illegal behavior, but it's certainly what you call tax aggressive behavior. So if we look at Starbucks, which is on every corner in the UK, almost 400 million in revenue, but yet they're declaring a 32 million pound loss and paid 0 taxes in the UK. Well, it turns out that Starbucks 700 outlets in the UK, the reason they're not profitable is that related to the use of transfer pricing. They use inflated transfer pricing to the coffee trading subsidiaries in Switzerland. And so again, basically, they charge very high prices internally for the coffee to the UK outlets, but then they realize those profits in Switzerland and the subsidiaries where they pay a much lower tax rate. Okay. So there's a stream of research relating corporate governance to this kind of tax avoidance, which shows that weak shareholder control, so kind of agency problems, facilitate managers using tax shelters. But we see also that very strong shareholder control and demand for high profits leads to tax avoidance, because tax avoidance increases profits that shareholders can collect. Right? And a final point is that we see that linking CEO pay to stock market performance and increasing this sensitivity leads managers to be more tax aggressive, to pay lower rates of both foreign and domestic taxes. Once corruption or irresponsible behavior begins, there can be some kind of mutually enforcing interaction between internal, organizational, and external elements. So if we think about individual ethics and the role of people like the traders in Enron, here shown in blue, we have individual decisions, we have the attributes of people that maybe make them more or less likely, their propensity to rationalize unethical decisions, and kind of self-deception. So we have a lot of things at the level of individual psychology, so-called bad apple explanation. That's people who do bad things. But people do things in a context. This is the yellow or orange bubbles here. Kind of bad barrels argument that within an organization there's a culture, there's a pressure to conform, there's an availability of rationales, there's ways which the organization distances itself ethically, and there's kind of the complexity of the organization that people are just doing one part of a bigger set of activities. So there's ways in which that once a dynamic starts, the kind of pressures or things from the organizational environment shape individuals, and similarly individuals in leadership or positions can influence the dynamics of the organization as a whole. That whole thing, the whole dynamic of corruption at the organizational level, also relates to the kind of external environment and the kind of interface of corporate governance, with kind of dominance of financial pressures, short-termism, and the complexity of the financial system. So this is just to say that when we look for explanations for bad behavior, it's not about just blaming individuals. It's also not just about saying, well, it's the fault of the organization, or it's also not just fine to say, well, it's the system, it's capitalism or corporate governance or the financial system as a whole. But all of these things work together that can escalate corruption, and often particular kinds of corruption, like, again, using the Enron scandal or the later the Lehman crisis and the crisis of these mortgage-backed securities in the United States. These kind of corruption can kind of come in waves, and certain kinds of corruption kind of spread and become quite predominant at a particular time and place. Okay. So there's a kind of tough question that we have to ask then, well, what's the relationship between good behavior and bad behavior, and is, the spread of CSR, what's it doing to hinder or support the spreading of bad behavior? And we can look at this again using data from the United States over several decades and see, for example, that through the 1990s and 2000, US firms started doing a lot more good things related to diversity and equal opportunity, gender equality, and against racial discrimination. And basically bad behavior, here in red, the concerns around diversity issues at those same companies, stayed the same or kind of declined over time. But we see in other areas, for example, employee rights issues, environmental issues, and product safety issues, that there's a kind of increase in concerns, a kind of decline of moral standards taking place. This is a bit surprising given that there's more and more environmental CSR, or even some increase in employee-related CSR. So when we look at the correlation between good and bad behavior, what we want to see here is a negative correlation, like in the case of diversity, that the more good you do, the less harm. But we see that in most of the areas on this list, employee rights, but very strongly in the environment, very strongly product safety, there's actually a positive correlation, which seems to be that the more harm you do, you adopt good practices to kind of counterbalance, or it could be the case that you adopt good practices to have a kind of moral license to engage in risky or bad behavior. So it's kind of disturbing that when we look at the level of country and the kind of average scores that the company might have, for example, in Germany, we see a lot of CSR, so we're high on the vertical axis, but also quite high on degrees of scandals and irresponsible behavior. So Germany, France, the UK all fall into this. The United States is a little bit a strange case because we have a lot of bad behavior and not so much responsible behavior. And, whereas in, say, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, or Japan, we see that you have fairly high levels of responsible behavior, but this is reducing levels of bad behavior. So what I'm trying to say, we want to be in that kind of category, but Germany seems to be in a case where the CSR adoption is not really leading to less bad behavior, or at least below average levels of bad behavior. So we need to question a bit more of what's the relationship between these two and what's going on here. So what is it actually in terms of institutions that influence the levels of irresponsible behavior? So this is thinking at the kind of level of country level institutions. And we see, for example, that countries where the stock market is very strongly developed, where the corporate governance system is very oriented toward shareholder value, that there's a kind of positive effect on irresponsible behavior. We won't go through all of these things, but for example, taxing companies may reduce irresponsible behavior, and also giving employees stronger rights through works councils and employment protection seems to lead to less irresponsible behavior. So what about those cases where both are happening at the same time, where we see companies adopting CSR and still they're doing lots of bad stuff? A good concept to understand this is the idea of decoupling, drawing from organizational theory, which decoupling says you use a formal structure to meet institutional demands, such as CSR, but these are disconnected from the actual practice in the company. So sometimes this is referred to as window dressing or greenwashing, symbolic compliance. So we see a company adopts lots of CSR, but doesn't really change very much the kind of core sort of activities. So you have a kind of external recognition, something that looks good according to a compliance program. It gets a kind of positive legitimacy, but in reality it's a kind of facade. The CSR label, for example, is kind of a deceptive sales practice, basically. Next, let's look at the role of reputation and how good and bad behavior impact reputation, and whether the threat of reputational sanctions can play a role in corporate governance. So if we go back to our starting discussion of different models of the corporation, the regulatory model where we have state regulation based on law, state agencies enforce rules and norms. Those rules and norms are aimed at the kind of public interest. Right? We had, in contrast to that, a CSR-based model where companies engage in voluntary self-regulation. Enforcement occurs through private actors, through kind of market mechanisms. We buy green products or not. And this is kind of focused on the positive some aspects, the kind of win-win between corporations and stakeholders. So the idea here is that through CSR, and in terms of a business case, a kind of CSR business case, relies on CSR translating into some kind of reputational advantage. And reputation is something like having a good reputation is something more than just saying you're legitimate, you're kind of okay. But reputation is sort of something on top that can differentiate you from other corporations. So you can think of legitimacy as a baseline norm, kind of taken for granted standard, like no medicine you buy is going to be like harmful to you. This is some kind of basic standard of that everyone in the market needs to take care about. And reputation is sort of what you do beyond this expected, particularly that differentiates you from others. And so reputation is also formed against the background of the regulatory institutions, and in some sense CSR is a model that rests on top of regulation. And as the role of state regulation decreases in the neoliberal era, reputation has played a bigger and bigger role for the development of CSR. So there's a kind of gray area then between what is legal behavior and what is sort of good behavior. And so let's look at these kind of like different shades of gray here. And the first one that we started out with in this 2x2 table earlier is the idea that bad behavior can actually be profitable. So by building up a good reputation, something like an asset that maybe companies then spend on being bad. Apple has an excellent reputation for well-designed products, and in some sense they spend part of this good reputation on being bad by having poor labor standards and increasing their profit margins. There's an issue of illegality. That's conduct that's not specifically prohibited by regulation, but simply falls into an unregulated gray area. It's clearly not illegal, but it's not clearly legal either. So corporations may exploit this. They may, for example, shift to an ex-ante specification of rules. So they may not, for example, say, yeah, we're committed to being green, but not really use clear standards so that in some sense they don't miss targets later on. So basically making vague promises so that no matter what the behavior is later, it can be told in a way that's kind of consistent. There's issues of regulatory arbitrage, basically using transactions that are unregulated in place of an economically equivalent transaction that has regulatory costs. This can be shifting certain activities of a corporation to another location where there's different regulations. We saw this a bit in the tax case of Starbucks, so using Switzerland as tax domicile rather than UK. The fifth one, ex post assessment, refers to a kind of idea that a regulator may state a general principle, but only evaluate the particular cases ex post. So having a principle rather than a rule, so that there's a kind of gray area in which companies may not know which behavior is determined illegal in the future, and therefore this can actually be an effective deterrent because to kind of prevent them from doing activities that might later be classified as illegal. So here's a case where the gray area can actually be as a deterrent. A final area is regulatory license, where gatekeepers certify certain things, legitimate access to markets like the AAA rating on mortgage-backed securities, and here again increase the temptation of corruption. So the gray areas that I showed you in the previous slide show that there's a kind of complex relationship between the law as a kind of baseline of societal norms and the development of reputation, and there can be ways in which that their gray areas create room for bad behavior, but also ways in which it can make corporations sort of think very more deeply about their reputation. So what is reputation? Reputation of a corporation can be defined as a stakeholder group specific assessment regarding an organization's capacity to create value based on characteristics and qualities. So the important thing here is that companies will have a different reputation depending on which stakeholder that we're talking about. So there's a close link between stakeholder theory and theories of reputation, and the idea that there's not one overall like Apple having a good reputation or a bad reputation, but you would say, oh, they have a good reputation for product design, maybe a bad reputation in terms of labor standards. So a key principle of reputation is that it's relational. Firms don't own their reputation. Reputations are sort of owned by others. And companies can influence it, institutions can influence it, but it's something that's not in the control of the organization itself, meaning there's also multiple reputations. They have a reputation for something and with someone. This can mean several different, even competing reputations. What makes reputation hard to measure? There's reputation intermediaries. There's different ways in which the media, regulators, gatekeepers like rating agencies shape and influence reputation. And the importance of reputation lies in the signaling power. Again, going back to the theories of asymmetric information. In terms of social responsibilities or irresponsibilities, we really rely on small signals that create enduring, sometimes distorted perceptions of what companies do. So what happens when companies do bad things? How does this play out in terms of their reputational dynamics? And here we come to the discussion forum that we had for the reading for this week, the shades of gray and the different kind of, different degrees of bad behavior, or behavior in which at least it's ambiguous whether or not it's bad, and stakeholders need to come to a opinion about this. And we see this metaphor we can apply a bit to Apple and the evolution of Apple's logo from the nice rainbow of its early days to the kind of corporate gray in the later years. This is described in one of the short articles that you have this week. So the kind of baseline or implicit theory that we have is that, of course, doing bad, a negative action or evaluation should lead to a bad reputation, and that companies should be rewarded for positive action with developing a good reputation. But it turns out that there's a lot of evidence for cases in which companies do negative actions or have in part a bad evaluation, yet their overall reputation remains good. In other words, it doesn't seem to be the case always that corporations are sort of punished by doing bad things. So we'd expect punishment for bad things based on stigmatization theory, which explains when information about bad actions is likely to damage a firm's reputation. There can be an individual cognitive process that basically we associate certain things with, we process certain things with a certain attitude, and this influences reputation. And an entity like a company can become stigmatized when that kind of negative association starts to dominate, right? So, for example, many people remember the case of like Nestle, who was, for example, distributing the artificial baby milk and kind of selling this in developing countries. So mothers would mix the powder with water, but in a lot of these places there wasn't access to clean water, so it was obviously not very good to replace mother's milk with this kind of artificial thing. And some babies were dying, and Nestle got a kind of a stigmatized attitude, oh, they're baby killers or something like that. So this is going back some decades, but can be that a particular event or something really shapes and makes a negative association and creates a kind of stigma. So we might think of cigarette companies or oil companies as being kind of stigmatized industries, which are by their nature, their activities are kind of, we have maybe doubtful associations about them from an environmental point of view or from a health and safety point of view. So there's a bunch of literature on reputational penalties and say, how strongly does bad behavior lead to kind of stigmatization? Karpov did a very interesting survey of 50 different research papers, activities in this kind of quadrant 4, profitable but harmful to society, and did show that there is some kind of penalty that firm engaged in misconduct, for example, lying on financial reports, does decrease value. Okay. And it also showed that reputation is at play because the losses that those firms faced exceed the direct cost of misconducts, like how much you pay in the lawsuit. So, for example, in the case of financial fraud, you lose not only the fraudulent amount, but there's a kind of 25% penalty, which is quite big compared to the legal, how much you actually get fined or the kind of direct penalty through legal actions. So this seems to be a kind of good news message in the case that reputation matters and it's quite affecting companies' values and therefore should be a kind of deterrent to bad behavior. There's a however. This kind of reputational penalty doesn't apply to all kinds of bad behaviors. Financial fraud is something that investors care a lot about and they react to this. But when we do the same kind of review of studies in relation to environmental violations, or for example, if companies engage in bribery in foreign countries, basically here investors or other stakeholders don't face a direct harm from the bad behavior and don't really have any incentive to change their relationship to the firm. So for example, if you find out that Volkswagen that company X, so this is a fictitious example, if you find out that automobile company X bribed some officials in Brazil to increase sales on their cars, it doesn't make your car in Germany less safe or less good to drive, and therefore it might not really affect your behavior as a consumer. Similarly, environmental problems may not really affect investors, and so there's a kind of general observation we can make that in not all kinds of misconduct harm firms' reputation with specific stakeholders. So reputation seems to work only sometimes. And there's many areas in which reputation doesn't seem to really create a kind of substantial penalty. So we try to explore a little bit, how is it overall, on the whole? Is reputation playing a big role? And here we looked again with US companies, looking in a data set in the late 2000s, early 2010s, looking at the number of concerns, these are incidents of bad behavior, and then looking at reputation scores based on the kind of Fortune Most Admired Corporation index, and basically kind of comparing those with fewer concerns, their average reputation score with those of more concerns. And we see that actually, if you compare the first quartile, the fewest concerns, and the most concerns, that actually there's no significant difference between that. seems actually that corporations with moral concerns have slightly higher scores than the other ones. So we try to break this down a little bit in terms of the category of concern and compare companies with concerns in different areas. And here again, there's some small differences. For example, in the case of diversity, the score goes down a little bit when the concern's present. But basically, there's no statistically significant difference regarding these presence or absence of concerns and the overall reputation of firms. We looked in even more detail about changes in reputation when new concerns appear, or whether there's any kind of change. And again, there seemed to be some kind of decline of reputation, but this doesn't differ depending on the total number of concerns. And we look at reputation and change in the number of concerns. So firms with an increased number of concerns staying the same and reduced number of concerns. And here again we see some basically some negative shift in reputation, but it's very, very tiny, and it's basically none of these changes are statistically significant. So if these big corporations, scandals occur and so forth, it doesn't seem to have any really major impact on the kind of overall reputation that you might see in a Fortune ranking. So this leads to a kind of puzzle why reputational responses to bad behavior are so weak. Why don't people care more? Why aren't we more driven by ethical kind of considerations? So a very interesting aspect of reputation is how is bad behavior and irresponsibility evaluated? And there's two ways in which this can take place: a capability reputation or capability evaluation about the quality and performance characteristics of a particular firm. So what can the firm do? What are its capabilities? Could they do something or not? And the character reputation, which are judgments about the firm's incentive structure and behaviors based on prior actions. What would a firm sort of be likely to do? And here the idea is that there's different kind of cues when bad behavior takes place, like why did the company do it? And people can say, well, for example, there was a lack of capability, there was a kind of problem, and therefore I evaluate this in terms of capability. Or we could say, well, gee, the bad thing they did, it was on purpose. They knew about it. It had to do with their character. And this would affect their reputation for character. And it turns out that the kind of negative effect of a evaluation of bad character would punishes companies more. So when we think of the Volkswagen scandal, for example, we could start to think, well, did they know about this, emission software? Who knew about it? Was it a kind of technical mistake? Or, no, someone programmed the software for deception on purpose, and in fact some top management knew about it, in which case we might say, okay, this is a kind of character judgment about the kind of deep nature of the company, right? So, an honest mistake or a intentional lie makes a big difference about how, whether or not bad behavior translates into, a kind of lasting impact on reputation. So, in the discussion of the gray areas that we're having this week, there's lots of different types of effects that shape the response that people have to irresponsible behaviors. So whether or not the issue is salient to stakeholders, we said already that investors maybe don't care so much about the environment, NGOs do. So which stakeholders being impacted, whether the affected party is complicit or not. So for example, if all of you buy Apple products, then, well, the kind of, bad labor standards that Apple products might have, you're complicit in this as a consumer, and therefore blaming the company means also maybe blaming yourself. So there's a kind of identity-based relationship that consumers maybe have to the firm, and it can be hard for people to kind of break through this and condemn the firm. And then it depends whether we think that the company's doing this on purpose, basically it's their character flaw, or whether it was kind of a mistake, issue of competence that can be quite fixed. There's some more macro level determinants, like who's responsible, there's a lack of clear accountability for an issue. What about the performance standards among peers? So is everybody doing the same thing? Are there differences in standards of behavior? So when we get into behavior standards declining over time, we can think of the COVID pandemic now. In the first days, everyone was staying in lockdown. In the next days, everyone's wearing a mask. And slowly, standards of behavior are getting looser and looser and looser. And, we'll see where this leads us in the longer term. In the macro picture, are there social movements and NGOs to certify standards, promote transparency, and we also had this issue of proliferation of too many standards and companies being able to choose standards like eco-labels that are maybe too easy to meet. So this is a long list, and again, it's not for you to memorize all these in detail, but just to say that, companies can do bad things. Yes, there's probably going to be something like a negative reaction among different stakeholders to this, but whether or not that really impacts the overall reputation of the company is like very complex. There's many micro factors, macro factors that shape this process, shape this relationship. It's a very interesting issue of research, but it's not so simple to say that companies are not going to do bad things because it would just hurt their reputation. This is certainly not the case, and it's not what we are finding out in our research. So for today, I'd like you to remember the concept of corporate social irresponsibility, the relation of irresponsible actions to corporate governance and CSR, and ask yourself the question what governance role reputation might play, given that the link between irresponsible actions and scandals and long-term reputation seems to be quite complex, and something that we'll discuss a bit more in the tutorial. So thank you for your attention. Have a good day and have a good summer break, as this is our last session. Thank you very much.